What happens when a CEO steps into his own diner, not as the boss, but as just another customer, only to uncover the hidden struggles behind the friendly smiles? Elijah Bennett sat in his office, staring at the stack of customer complaints spread across his desk. The papers were covered in red markings, notes scribbled in the margins, each one detailing a dissatisfied guest's experience at one of his diners. Complaints about long wait times, rude employees, and forgotten orders were increasing by the week. Even worse, employee turnover was at an all-time high. For the past decade, Elijah had worked tirelessly to build Bennett's Family Diner from a single location into a chain of 13 restaurants. His vision had always been simple: create a welcoming, family-friendly place where customers felt at home and employees felt valued. But lately, things had changed. His regional managers assured him that everything was running smoothly, but the reports did not match the reality he was beginning to see. He had heard rumors from former employees, stories of poor management, overworked staff, and toxic leadership in some locations. Something was wrong, and no spreadsheet or sales report was going to tell him what it was. There was only one way to find out. Elijah leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. He would go undercover. The next morning, he stood in front of his bathroom mirror, barely recognizing the man staring back at him. Gone was the polished CEO in tailored suits and crisp dress shirts. In his place stood a man with a scruffy beard, an old hoodie, worn-out jeans, and thick-rimmed glasses. He looked like an average customer, someone who would blend into the crowd without drawing attention. He had chosen one of his suburban locations, a diner 2 hours away from his corporate office. It was far enough that none of the employees would recognize him, and based on the growing number of complaints from that location, it seemed like the perfect place to start. Slipping on a faded baseball cap, Elijah grabbed his car keys and headed out. It was time to see the truth for himself. The moment Elijah stepped inside the diner, the familiar chime of the entrance bell rang through the space. At first glance, the place looked fine. The floors were clean, the tables neatly arranged, and the booths, though worn, were still in decent shape. But something felt off. The energy in the room was tense. A quick glance around the restaurant told him everything he needed to know. Customers were shifting impatiently in their seats, checking their watches. A family at the booth behind him muttered about how long they had been waiting for their food. 2 teenagers near the counter whispered about how rude the manager had been to a waitress earlier. Elijah's stomach tightened. This wasn't how his diners were supposed to feel. A young waitress hurried past him, balancing a tray filled with plates. Her name tag read, Sophie. She had a polite smile, but there was something in her eyes, exhaustion, stress, something that made her look like she was carrying the weight of the entire restaurant on her shoulders. She stopped at his table, offering a strained but friendly greeting. "Hi there, welcome to Bennett's. Can I get you something to drink?" Elijah nodded. "Just coffee, thanks." Sophie quickly jotted it down and rushed off. He watched as she moved between tables, refilled drinks, and managed multiple orders all at once. She was fast, efficient, and clearly overworked. Then from the kitchen, a voice boomed. "Sophie, what's taking so long? You're falling behind again." Elijah turned his head toward the sound. A stocky man in his 40s, wearing a stained apron, stood at the pass-through window, his arms crossed. Greg. He hadn't introduced himself when Elijah walked in, which was already a red flag. Managers were supposed to be the backbone of the team, making sure everything ran smoothly, but Greg's tone was filled with impatience and frustration. Sophie flinched slightly but nodded. "Coming right up," she called back, keeping her voice steady. Elijah clenched his jaw. This wasn't the kind of leadership he had built his business on. Employees were supposed to feel supported, not berated in front of customers. Elijah Bennett sat back in his booth, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly as he took in the scene around him. The diner was busier now, the lunch rush in full swing. Plates clattered, the low hum of conversation filled the air, and the kitchen bell rang out as orders were completed. But despite the movement and noise, there was something missing. It was warmth. This place was supposed to feel like home, a welcoming space where families could gather, where employees felt like they were part of something bigger. Instead, it felt strained. Like everyone, from the staff to the customers, was just enduring the experience rather than enjoying it. He had built Bennett's Family Diner on the foundation of good food, good service, and good people, but something had gone wrong along the way. He turned his attention back to Sophie. She moved quickly between tables, balancing trays, refilling drinks, and taking orders with a tired but practiced efficiency. Every time she reached the kitchen window to grab a new plate, Greg, the shift manager, barked instructions at her. "Hurry it up! Keep moving! You're falling behind, Sophie." Elijah watched as she swallowed back her exhaustion, nodded, and continued working without complaint. Her exhaustion wasn't just from the lunch rush, it was deeper than that. It was the weight of knowing she would have to do this again tomorrow and the day after that, with no relief in sight. A few minutes later, she arrived at his table, setting his plate down with a forced smile. "Sorry for the wait," she said, keeping her eyes downcast. "No worries," Elijah replied, offering a small, reassuring smile. "You're doing great." Her eyes flicked up, surprised by the kindness, before she nodded and hurried away. Elijah picked up his burger, about to take a bite, when something made him freeze. A sound, a quiet, muffled sob coming from the kitchen. His grip on his fork tightened. It was Sophie. He placed his burger back down and listened closely. "I'm trying my best, okay?" Sophie's voice wavered, filled with frustration and exhaustion. "I haven't had a break in 6 hours, and I'm doing everything I can." Greg's response was sharp, dismissive. "If you can't handle the pressure, maybe this isn't the job for you." Elijah clenched his jaw. This was the exact kind of toxic management he had sworn his business would never have. He had seen it before in other corporate environments. Managers who mistook control for leadership, who ruled with intimidation instead of support. And now it was happening in his own diner. He couldn't sit back and watch. Sliding out of the booth, he walked toward the kitchen doors, pushing them open just enough to see inside. Sophie stood near the counter, her hands trembling as she wiped her eyes on her sleeve. Greg loomed over her, arms crossed, his expression impatient and unmoved by her distress. A young line cook, a wiry man with a nervous energy, hesitated nearby. His name tag read, Daniel. He seemed torn between speaking up and staying silent. The tension in the kitchen was thick. Elijah had seen enough. He stepped fully into the room, clearing his throat. "Is there a problem here?" Greg turned sharply, his brows furrowing as he looked Elijah up and down. "Who the hell are you?" Greg asked, his tone laced with irritation. Elijah ignored him, turning instead to Sophie. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Sophie hesitated, darting a quick glance at Greg before nodding quickly. "I'm fine," she said, though the crack in her voice betrayed the truth. Elijah didn't believe her. Greg scoffed. "Look, buddy, this is none of your business. We're just running a restaurant here. It gets stressful. She knows that." Elijah tilted his head slightly. 6 hours without a break? That's not stress. That's mismanagement. Greg's jaw tightened. "We're short-staffed. It's not my fault." Daniel, the young cook, suddenly spoke up, his voice quiet but firm. "She hasn't even had time to grab a drink of water." Greg snapped his glare toward Daniel. "Stay out of this." Elijah took a step closer, his expression unreadable. "And who's in charge of making sure the team doesn't burn out?" he asked, his voice calm but cutting. Greg hesitated. "I mean, we're all working hard," he muttered, suddenly less sure of himself. "Hard work isn't the issue," Elijah said. "It's how you treat people while they're doing it." Greg folded his arms. "And what makes you an expert on running a diner?" Elijah held his gaze for a long moment before replying. "If I were your boss, I'd have a serious problem with how you're running this shift." Greg's face paled slightly, but he quickly masked it with a scoff. "Well, you're not my boss, so—" Elijah cut him off. "Not yet." Greg blinked in confusion. Elijah turned to Sophie. "You need a break," he said, his voice gentler now. "Take 5 minutes." Sophie's eyes flicked to Greg nervously. I don't think I can." "You can," Elijah insisted. "And you will." Greg opened his mouth to argue, but Elijah shot him a warning look. "She's taking a break, right now." The authority in his voice made Greg hesitate, and after a long pause, he stepped back. Sophie hesitated before nodding quickly and slipping past the swinging kitchen doors. Elijah watched her go, then turned his gaze back to Greg. "You and I need to have a conversation," he said evenly. Greg scoffed. "And why would I waste my time talking to you?" Elijah gave him a slow, knowing smile. "Oh, trust me," he said. "You're going to want to hear what I have to say." Because soon, Greg was going to learn exactly who he had been talking to. Elijah Bennett leaned against the counter, watching the door swing shut behind Sophie as she stepped out of the kitchen. She had hesitated before taking that break, which told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't just about one bad day. This was a pattern. Greg, the shift manager, crossed his arms, his expression guarded. He was still trying to figure out who Elijah was and why he was interfering. "Look," Greg said, his voice lowering as if trying to sound reasonable. "I don't know what you think you're doing, but we run a tight ship here. If we let every employee take breaks whenever they feel like it, nothing would get done." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "She's been working for 6 hours without a break," he said evenly. "And from what I've seen, she's still handling more tables than anyone else." Greg scoffed. "Everyone works hard. That's the job. If she can't handle it, maybe she should go work somewhere easier." Elijah let the words hang in the air for a moment, studying Greg's face. "You've been managing this place for 2 years, right?" Elijah asked. Greg nodded, his stance stiffening. "That's right." "And in those 2 years, how many employees have quit?" Greg hesitated. "People come and go. That's the restaurant business." Elijah narrowed his eyes. "It's also a sign of bad leadership." Greg's expression darkened. "Who even are you?" Before Elijah could answer, the kitchen door swung open, and Sophie stepped back inside. She had wiped her face, and though her eyes were still red, she looked more composed. She glanced nervously at Greg, then at Elijah. "Sorry," she said quickly, grabbing a tray as if to prove she was ready to work again. Elijah held up a hand, stopping her. "Can I ask you something, Sophie?" he said gently. She hesitated. Sure? How long have you worked here?" "Almost 8 months," she replied. "And in those 8 months, how many breaks have you been able to take during busy shifts like this?" Sophie swallowed, glancing at Greg again before answering. "Not many," she admitted. "Usually we're too short-staffed, so we just keep going." Elijah nodded, his suspicions confirmed. "And how often do people quit?" Sophie hesitated again. "A lot." Greg groaned. "Come on, this is ridiculous. What does it matter?" "It matters," Elijah said, his voice calm but firm. "Because high turnover, stressed employees, and unhappy customers don't just happen by accident. It means there's a problem." Sophie looked like she wanted to say more, but Greg's presence kept her quiet. Elijah turned his gaze to the young cook, Daniel, who had been listening in silence, his hands still busy chopping vegetables. "What about you, Daniel?" Elijah asked. "How long have you been here?" Daniel glanced up, clearly startled to be included. About 4 months." "And how's it been?" Daniel hesitated, then carefully chose his words. "It's a lot." Greg shot him a glare. Daniel exhaled, shifting uncomfortably before continuing. "I mean, I knew restaurant work was going to be tough, but it's the way things are handled, you know? We're always short-staffed, and if anything goes wrong, we're the ones getting yelled at. It just—" He paused, glancing at Sophie. "It just wears people down." Elijah noticed Sophie nodding slightly, even as she kept her eyes on the floor. Greg rolled his eyes. "Oh, please, Daniel. Don't act like you've got it so bad. You're lucky to even have this job." Daniel's hands clenched into fists. Elijah's patience finally snapped. "No, Greg," he said, his voice cutting through the tension. "They're not lucky to have this job. You're lucky they haven't walked out on you yet." Greg turned red. "Who the hell do you think you are to talk to me like that?" Elijah reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. He flipped it open, revealing his company ID. "I'm Elijah Bennett," he said, his voice steady, "and I own this diner." The kitchen fell into complete silence. Sophie's eyes widened in shock. Daniel nearly dropped his knife. Greg's face drained of color. Elijah held his gaze, letting the reality of the situation sink in. "I came here because I wanted to see for myself what's been happening in my business," Elijah continued. "And now I know, employees working nonstop without breaks, a manager who thinks intimidation is leadership, customers noticing the tension and leaving unhappy." He shook his head. "This is not what I built." Greg opened his mouth, but no words came out. "Now," Elijah said, his tone sharp, "if you want to keep your job, you're going to start treating your team with the respect they deserve." Greg swallowed hard. "Look, You're done for today," Elijah interrupted. "Go home." Greg's jaw dropped. "You can't just—" "I can," Elijah said, "and I am." Greg clenched his fists, his nostrils flaring. but one look at Elijah told him there was no room for negotiation. He yanked off his apron, threw it onto the counter, and stormed out the back door without another word. A long silence followed. Sophie stared at Elijah. "You really own this place?" Elijah nodded. "And you fired him?" "For now," Elijah said. "I'll decide if it's permanent once I talk to my HR team." Daniel let out a slow breath. "Wow." Elijah turned back to Sophie. "How do you feel?" She hesitated, then whispered, "Lighter." Elijah gave a small nod. "Good, because things are about to change around here." The silence in the diner stretched long after Greg had stormed out. Sophie still looked stunned, her hands gripping the edges of her apron, as if she wasn't sure whether to believe what had just happened. Daniel stood frozen behind the counter, his knife still in hand, as if he expected someone to come in and tell them it was all a joke. Elijah, however, remained calm. He had seen enough. He glanced around the kitchen, then back at Sophie. "Are you okay?" he asked. Sophie let out a slow breath. "I think so," she said hesitantly, rubbing at her arm as if to ground herself. I didn't expect that." Daniel nodded. "Me neither," he admitted. "I mean, we always talked about how someone needed to do something about Greg, but I never thought—" He trailed off, shaking his head in disbelief. Elijah gave them both a small, reassuring smile. "Well, it was overdue," he said simply. "But let's get back to work. The lunch rush isn't over." Sophie blinked. "You're staying?" Elijah nodded. "Of course. I want to see how things run without someone barking orders and making the shift harder for everyone." Daniel let out a quiet chuckle. "Well, it can only go up from here." Sophie managed a small smile, though there was still lingering tension in her eyes. She turned back toward the dining area, pushing through the kitchen doors, and Elijah followed. As they stepped back onto the floor, the customers who had been watching quickly turned back to their meals, though a few shot curious glances in Elijah's direction. He had no doubt that word would spread quickly that the random customer was actually the owner. Sophie moved back to work, her steps still a little hesitant, but lighter than before. She refilled coffee, took orders, and for the first time since Elijah had arrived, she seemed to be breathing a little easier. As Elijah slid back into his booth, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small notebook. He began jotting down everything he had observed, the staff workload, customer complaints, and the overall atmosphere. He needed a full picture of what was happening, not just today, but in the long term. After a few minutes, he caught Sophie passing by. "Hey," he called softly. She paused. "Yeah?" "I know this has been a rough day," he said, setting his pen down. "But I wanted to ask, how long has it been like this? With Greg?" Sophie hesitated, glancing at a nearby table where a couple was finishing their meal. When she saw they weren't paying attention, she leaned in slightly. "A while," she admitted. "Ever since he became manager, things just changed. It started small, just being strict about shifts, making sure everyone was working hard. But then it got worse." Elijah nodded, encouraging her to continue. "He started cutting people's hours if they complained," Sophie said, lowering her voice. "If you called out sick, you'd suddenly find yourself working the worst shifts for weeks. And if anyone questioned him, he'd make sure they regretted it." Elijah's jaw tightened. How did he get away with that? Sophie gave a dry laugh. No one wanted to report him. The last person who tried, well, they didn't last long. They suddenly got written up for things that never happened, and then one day, they were gone. Elijah sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He had trusted his regional managers to oversee things, but clearly they had missed this, or ignored it. "And the others?" he asked. "How do they feel?" Sophie glanced toward the kitchen, where Daniel was still prepping food. "Most of them are too tired to fight back. We're always short-staffed, and we need the money, so we just deal with it. But it's not just about Greg. This place, it feels like no one at the top cares about us." That last sentence stung more than Elijah wanted to admit. Before he could respond, Daniel came out from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a rag. "She's right," he said, stopping by the booth. "It's not just about Greg being a jerk, it's the whole system. The way things have been run for the past couple of years, it's like we're just numbers on a spreadsheet." Elijah frowned. "How so?" Daniel shrugged. "The schedules are a mess, we're always understaffed, and when we bring it up, the managers just say it's budget cuts or corporate policy. but none of us actually know what's going on. All we know is we're working harder for the same pay, and no one listens. Elijah took a deep breath, nodding slowly. I hear you, he said. Daniel looked skeptical. Do you? Elijah met his gaze. I wouldn't be here if I didn't. Daniel studied him for a moment, then sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Well, I hope that's true. Sophie glanced between them, still processing everything. So, what now? She asked hesitantly. Elijah tapped his pen against his notebook. Now, I need to take a closer look at things. Employee files, scheduling, payroll, everything. Daniel let out a short laugh. You mean actually running the place like you own it? Elijah smirked. Exactly. Sophie shook her head, still in disbelief. I can't believe you're actually doing this. Elijah smiled, but his expression turned serious. I built this company on the idea that employees should feel valued. That's why I started it in the first place. If that's changed, then I've failed, and I don't plan on failing? Daniel nodded slowly, and for the first time, there was real trust in his expression. Well, if you're serious, then I guess we'll see what happens. Sophie gave him a small smile. And if you really do care, then thanks. Elijah nodded. Let's fix this. And with that, the real work began. The next morning, Elijah arrived at the diner just as the first shift was starting. He wasn't wearing his disguise anymore. There was no point in hiding. His employees knew who he was now, and he had work to do. The moment he stepped inside, he could feel the change in atmosphere. Without Greg looming over them, the staff moved with a little more ease, but exhaustion still clung to their faces. They were used to working under stress, running on empty, and always expecting the worst. A single day without Greg wasn't enough to undo months, maybe years, of mistreatment. Elijah wasn't here for a quick fix. He was here to rebuild. Sophie was already at work, taking orders at a booth near the window. When she saw Elijah, she hesitated before giving him a small, uncertain smile. Daniel, in the kitchen, gave a nod before returning to the grill. Elijah walked to the counter, leaning against it as Sophie came by to grab coffee refills. How's the morning going? Elijah asked casually. Sophie bit her lip. Better, she admitted, but we're still short-staffed. Elijah nodded. I know, that's the first thing I'm working on. Before she could respond, a customer at the counter waved her down, and she hurried off. Elijah turned his attention to Daniel, who was plating up a stack of pancakes. Daniel! Elijah called. The young line cook looked up. How are things in the kitchen? Daniel wiped sweat from his forehead. Less stressful without Greg breathing down my neck, he admitted. But we're still behind. There's only 2 of us back here during breakfast rush. Noted, Elijah said. I'll fix that. He walked back to the manager's office, grabbed a pen and notepad, and started making a list. The first issue was staffing. No one should have to run an entire morning shift with only 2 cooks. He made a note to increase kitchen staff. Next, scheduling. Employees were clearly overworked. He'd seen Sophie and Daniel running on fumes for 2 days straight. That needed to change. By the time he was done, he had a full plan. Now, it was time to put it into action. Later that afternoon, Elijah sat in the office, reviewing applications for a new manager. He wasn't going to make the same mistake again. This person had to be the right fit. Someone who knew how to lead, not just command. After several calls, one name stood out. Vanessa Turner. She had over a decade of experience managing restaurants and had a reputation for treating her staff with fairness and respect. Her former employees spoke highly of her. She wasn't just a manager, she was a leader. Elijah called her for an interview. The next morning, Vanessa arrived promptly at the diner, dressed professionally but comfortably. She had warm eyes, a confident stance, and an air of authority that wasn't intimidating but reassuring. Mr. Bennett, she greeted him, shaking his hand firmly. I appreciate the opportunity. Elijah, he corrected, and the opportunity is mutual. He led her to a booth in the quieter part of the diner, ordering 2 coffees before getting to the point. I'm not looking for just any manager, Elijah said. This place has been through a lot. The staff needs someone who respects them, listens to them, and leads by example. I need to know, are you that person? Vanessa leaned forward. I don't believe in running a restaurant through fear, she said simply. I believe in building trust. If you take care of your employees, they take care of your customers. Elijah studied her for a moment, then smiled. You're hired. With a new manager in place, Elijah turned his attention to the people who had been holding the diner together, Sophie and Daniel. That evening, after the last customer had left and the lights were dimmed, Elijah called them to a booth. Sit down, he said, motioning for them to join him. They exchanged glances before cautiously taking a seat. Elijah leaned forward. You two have been the backbone of this place, he said, and I want to make sure that doesn't go unnoticed. Sophie blinked. What do you mean? Elijah turned to Daniel first. Daniel, you stepped up in ways most people wouldn't. You defended your coworker when you didn't have to, and you've been holding this kitchen together. I'm promoting you to assistant manager. Daniel's mouth dropped open. What? Me? You've already been leading, Elijah said. Now you'll just get paid for it. Daniel looked stunned, but slowly, a grin spread across his face. I don't know what to say. Say yes, Elijah said with a chuckle. Daniel nodded quickly. Yes. Then Elijah turned to Sophie. And you, he said. You've been here the longest. You've dealt with the worst of it, and you still manage to be kind to customers and your coworkers. That's not just hard work. That's dedication. Sophie's hands curled into her lap. I just did what I had to do. No, Elijah corrected. You did more than that, and that's why I'm giving you a pay raise. Her eyes widened. Are you serious? Absolutely. For a moment, she didn't say anything. Then, to Elijah's surprise, her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. No one's ever done something like this for me before. Well, Elijah said, it's about time someone did. The next few days passed in a blur of changes. Vanessa settled into her role quickly, establishing clear expectations, but also making it known that her door was always open. New hires were brought in to balance the workload. No one was forced to work 6-hour stretches without a break anymore. The energy in the diner shifted. Customers noticed. The service was faster, the staff seemed happier, and the tension that had once weighed down the space had lifted. One afternoon, as Elijah prepared to head back to his corporate office, Sophie stopped him at the door. Hey, she said, twisting a napkin in her hands. I just wanted to say thank you for actually caring. Elijah smiled. That's my job. She shook her head. Number A, a lot of people say they care, but you proved it. Elijah felt a flicker of pride. That means a lot, he admitted. As he walked to his car, he realized something. This wasn't just about fixing a broken diner. It was about leadership, about the people who worked behind the counter, who made the business what it was. And for the first time in a long time, Elijah knew he wouldn't lose sight of that again. The first week under Vanessa's leadership was like the first deep breath after holding it in for too long. The tension that had suffocated the diner for months was slowly unraveling, and employees were beginning to feel it. For Sophie, it meant coming into work without the weight of anxiety pressing against her chest. It meant serving customers without constantly looking over her shoulder, afraid of being yelled at for something out of her control. For Daniel, it meant finally feeling like he had a future in this place, one that didn't involve just surviving another shift, but actually contributing to something better. For Elijah, it meant watching the changes unfold firsthand and knowing they were more than just surface-level adjustments. He sat at a booth in the corner, nursing a cup of coffee as he watched the morning shift in full swing. Sophie moved through the diner with ease, her energy lighter, her smile genuine. Daniel worked in the kitchen, his voice confident as he gave instructions to the newer cooks. Vanessa, meanwhile, was making her rounds, checking in with employees, listening, and actually hearing what they had to say. This was how it was supposed to be, but Elijah knew there was still more work to be done. Later that afternoon, Elijah gathered the entire staff for a short meeting before the dinner rush. They all stood in the dining area, some leaning against booths, others standing near the counter, looking at him expectantly. I just want to start by saying thank you, Elijah began, his gaze sweeping across the group. I know the past few months haven't been easy. I also know that when management fails, employees are the ones who suffer the most. That ends now. A few people nodded, while others simply listened, waiting to hear what he had to say next. We're making a lot of changes, Elijah continued, and that means all of you need to be involved. From now on, I want this diner to be a place where your voices are heard, where your hard work is valued. If you have concerns, ideas, or suggestions, don't keep them to yourselves. Come to Vanessa. come to me. We're listening." A murmur rippled through the group, hesitant but hopeful. "And to show you that this isn't just talk, we're implementing a new system," Elijah went on. "Every month we're going to have an employee feedback meeting. No filters, no sugarcoating, just honest conversations about what's working and what's not. And on top of that, we're launching a bonus system." That got their attention. Eyes widened, whispers spread through the room. "What kind of bonus system?" one of the newer servers, Jake, asked. Elijah smiled. "One that rewards hard work, outstanding customer service, teamwork, and going above and beyond. Those things will be recognized, not just with words, but with real financial incentives." Sophie's mouth parted slightly in surprise. "You mean like an actual bonus?" "Yes," Elijah said firmly. "This isn't just about fixing what's broken. It's about making sure that moving forward, the people who put in the effort are appreciated. No more being overworked and overlooked." A slow, growing wave of approval moved through the staff. Relief. Excitement. Some were still skeptical. Change was hard to believe when you'd been let down so many times before. But Elijah could see it in their eyes. They wanted to believe. Vanessa stepped forward then, crossing her arms as she addressed them. "This place is ours to rebuild," she said. "I know it's going to take time to adjust, but I promise you, Elijah means what he says, and so do I." The meeting ended with nods of agreement, some employees clapping, others sharing glances that carried a renewed sense of hope. The first shift under this new system was about to begin, and for the first time in a long time, the diner felt alive again. The changes weren't just felt by the employees. Customers began to notice too. Regulars who had grown used to the sluggish service and tired faces of the waitstaff suddenly found their orders arriving faster, their servers more engaged. The entire atmosphere was different. An elderly couple who had been eating at the diner for years pulled Sophie aside one afternoon. "This place feels different," the woman said, sipping her coffee. "Brighter, happier." Sophie, who had spent months trying to push through exhaustion just to make it to the end of her shift, smiled at them, really smiled. "Yeah," she said, "it is." A mother with 2 young children stopped Vanessa near the counter. "I don't know what changed here," she said, "but whatever it is, it's working. We used to love coming here, but for a while, it felt like everyone was just tired. Today, it feels good again." Vanessa nodded. "That's exactly what we're working toward." Even online reviews started to shift. Customers who had once left complaints about long wait times and rude management were now writing about the great service, the friendly atmosphere, the way the staff seemed happy to be there. Elijah read through the reviews one evening, sitting in the office as the smell of fresh coffee and grilled burgers drifted through the diner. He had expected it to take longer. Change wasn't easy. But it turned out that when you listened, really listened, to the people on the ground, the ones doing the real work, change could happen faster than you thought. As the week wrapped up, Elijah took a step back to reflect. The diner wasn't perfect yet. There were still things to fine-tune, adjustments to make, but it was better. And that meant everything. Before leaving for the night, he found Sophie wiping down a booth near the window. "Sophie," he called. She looked up. "Yeah?" He gestured for her to sit. She hesitated, then slid into the booth across from him. "I just wanted to thank you," Elijah said. Sophie blinked. "For what?" "For holding this place together when no one else was looking," he said simply. "For pushing through, even when you shouldn't have had to." She looked down, fiddling with the corner of a napkin. I guess I just didn't want to give up." Elijah nodded. "Well, you didn't. And now things are changing. Because of you. Because of people like you and Daniel, who cared enough to keep going." Sophie let out a small laugh. "Feels weird to hear that." "Well, get used to it," Elijah said, standing up. "Because from now on, people like you will be recognized." She smiled, this time without hesitation. "Thank you." Elijah gave a nod before heading toward the door, pausing to take one last look at the diner. The fluorescent lights flickered slightly, the scent of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air, and the quiet hum of conversation filled the space. This was what it was supposed to feel like. Not just a business, not just another diner, a place where people actually mattered. And Elijah was going to make sure it stayed that way. Regulars who had been visiting the diner for years noticed that their coffee cups were refilled faster, that their meals came out hot and fresh with fewer mistakes. They noticed that the waitstaff seemed present, engaged in conversation, smiling instead of looking exhausted and defeated. One afternoon, an older man named Mr. Holloway, who had been coming to the diner every week for over a decade, waved Sophie over. "You know," he said as he stirred his coffee, "I was just telling my wife, this place feels different lately." Sophie wiped her hands on her apron and gave him a small smile. "Different how?" He set his spoon down. "Better, lighter. I don't know what you all did, but it shows." Sophie felt a swell of pride in her chest. She hadn't realized just how much the tension had weighed on everyone, not just the staff, but the customers too. "Well," she said, glancing toward the kitchen where Vanessa was overseeing the line with calm efficiency, "I guess you could say we have a new way of doing things." Mr. Holloway nodded approvingly. "Whatever it is, keep it up." And it wasn't just the regulars. New customers started coming in, lured by the good reviews that had started to replace the bad ones online. One evening, Elijah sat in the office, going through customer feedback. The diner's online reviews, which had once been filled with complaints about poor service and rude management, were shifting. One review caught his eye. "I almost gave up on this place, but I decided to give it one last try. The difference was like night and day. The staff actually seems happy, the service is so much better. And I even saw the manager helping the waitstaff instead of just barking orders. Whatever changed, keep it up." Elijah grinned. Then came something unexpected. A food blogger with a decent following had visited the diner. He had been in town visiting family and had stopped by for a quick meal, not expecting much. But what he experienced took him by surprise. He wrote a post titled, "The Diner That Fixed Itself," and uploaded a photo of his meal along with a caption. "I came in expecting the usual rushed, half-hearted service of a chain diner. What I got instead was something else. The staff was engaged, the food was great, and the entire place had a warmth to it. Turns out the diner recently changed management, and it shows. Maybe more restaurants should take notes." Elijah read the post twice. A few months ago, no one would have written something like this. Now, not only was the service good enough to keep customers happy, but it was good enough to be talked about. And just like that, the diner's reputation was beginning to rebuild itself. One of the most significant changes, however, was happening behind the scenes. Vanessa, true to her word, held regular team meetings. Every staff member had the chance to share their thoughts, what was working, what wasn't, what they needed to do their jobs better. Sophie and Daniel were especially vocal. "We need more organized shifts," Daniel had pointed out one morning. "People are still getting burnt out, especially on weekends." Vanessa had listened, adjusted the schedule, and made sure no one was forced to work without proper breaks. "Thank you," Sophie had told her after one shift, "for actually listening." Vanessa had simply smiled. "That's my job." Elijah watched all of this unfold from a distance, feeling more confident in his decision to bring Vanessa in. For the first time in a long time, the team, not just individual employees, but the entire team, was working together, and that made all the difference. One afternoon, Elijah sat in his usual booth, drinking coffee and going over the diner's finances when Sophie approached, looking hesitant. He looked up. "What's on your mind?" She bit her lip before speaking. "I just wanted to say thank you for all of this, for giving us a chance." Elijah set his coffee down. "You don't have to thank me." "No, I do," she insisted, "because before this I was ready to quit. I thought this job was just something I had to suffer through to pay the bills. But now, I don't know. It feels different." Elijah nodded, feeling an odd sense of warmth in his chest. "Well," he said, "I guess that means we're doing something right." Sophie smiled. "Yeah, you are." As she walked away to help a new customer, Elijah leaned back in his seat, watching as the diner bustled with life. He had spent years focused on growing the business, expanding locations, and improving profits. But this was what actually mattered. The people, the ones who made the business run every day. And now, finally, they knew they mattered. The final confirmation came on a Saturday evening, just as the dinner rush started to wind down. An elderly woman walked up to the counter and smiled at Vanessa. "I just wanted to tell you," she said, "that this place reminds me of what it used to be like years ago, back when my husband and I would come here every Sunday. It feels like home again." Vanessa, touched, thanked her, and as the woman walked away, she turned to Elijah, who had been standing nearby. Home, she repeated, shaking her head with a smile. Can't get a better compliment than that. Elijah chuckled. No, you really can't. As he stepped outside and took in the sight of the diner, its neon sign glowing warmly against the evening sky, the chatter of customers spilling out onto the sidewalk, he knew they had done it. They had turned things around, and it was just the beginning. Elijah stood outside the diner in the crisp morning air, taking in the sight of the place he had fought so hard to rebuild. The neon sign flickered slightly, but it stood bright and strong, just like the people inside who had weathered the storm with him. The transformation wasn't just about better service or happier employees. It was about creating a place where people wanted to be, a place that felt like home again. But Elijah knew his job wasn't done yet. Before heading back to his corporate office, Elijah sat down with Vanessa, Sophie, and Daniel. The three of them had been instrumental in turning the diner around, and he wanted to make sure they knew just how much he appreciated them. You've all done an incredible job, Elijah said, leaning forward in his chair. This place wouldn't have turned around without your effort, your patience, and your commitment to doing things the right way. Vanessa gave a small smile, but there was still a hint of skepticism in her expression. So, what happens now? Do you go back to corporate and leave us to figure things out on our own? Elijah chuckled, shaking his head. Not exactly. My job is to make sure this kind of thing never happens again. Not just here, but at every location. He pulled out a folder from his bag and slid it across the table. This is a new company-wide initiative, he explained. It's going to be implemented across all of our diners, regular staff feedback meetings, new leadership training programs, and a better support system for employees. I'm making sure no location falls through the cracks again. Sophie's eyes widened. You mean, it's not just us? No, Elijah said firmly. What happened here made me realize that if this diner was struggling, then others might be too. I can't just assume everything is fine because the numbers look good. I need to make sure every location is actually running the way I intended when I started this company. Daniel nodded, understanding. So, we're the first step? Elijah smiled. Exactly. What we've built here is the model for how every diner should operate, a place where employees feel respected and customers feel welcomed. And it all starts with the people running the show, you guys. Elijah then turned to Vanessa. You've done more than just step in as manager, he said. You've rebuilt trust, improved morale, and reminded this team what leadership should look like. That's why I want you to take over as the regional manager for this district. Vanessa's jaw dropped. Regional manager? Elijah nodded. You'd oversee multiple locations, ensuring they don't fall into the same problems this one did. I need someone who understands the heart of this business, and that's you. For the first time since Elijah had met her, Vanessa looked speechless. Finally, she shook her head in disbelief. I don't even know what to say. Say yes, Sophie whispered with a grin. Vanessa let out a breath, then nodded. Yes, absolutely, yes. Elijah extended a hand, and she shook it firmly. As the meeting wrapped up, Elijah stood and stretched, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction settle in his chest. This is the last time I'll be here for a while, he admitted, looking around at the diner, but I know it's in good hands. Sophie, Daniel, and Vanessa stood with him, their expressions filled with gratitude. We won't let you down, Vanessa promised. I know you won't, Elijah said with a smile. He took one last look around before stepping toward the door. As he walked outside, the morning sun warmed his face, and for the first time in years, he felt like he was leaving something behind that was better than when he found it. This wasn't just about one diner. It was about every diner. It was about making sure no one was left unheard again. Elijah returned to his corporate headquarters with a renewed sense of purpose. That afternoon, he called a company-wide meeting with his regional managers. He stood at the front of the conference room, looking at the faces of the people who had been running his company. We need to do better, he said simply. Because leadership isn't just about numbers, it's about people, and from now on, we're going to make sure every location reflects that. The managers exchanged glances, sensing the shift in his tone. This company was built on the idea of treating people with respect, both employees and customers. Somewhere along the way, we lost sight of that, but that changes now. He laid out the new initiative, making it clear that every diner under his brand would follow the same principles that had been restored at Vanessa's location. We're not just running restaurants, he finished. We're building communities. Let's act like it. A week later, Elijah received a message from Sophie. It was a picture of the diner during a busy evening rush, the place filled with happy customers and smiling employees. Thought you'd want to see this. We're doing just fine. Elijah smiled at his phone, knowing she was right. As long as they kept listening to the people who made it all work, they would always be just fine. This wasn't just the end of a challenge. It was the beginning of something better. This story is a reminder that leadership isn't about standing at the top. It's about standing with the people who make everything possible. A great business isn't built on policies or profits alone. It's built on trust, respect, and the willingness to listen. What do you think? Should more CEOs take the time to experience their businesses from the ground up? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more inspiring leadership stories.